For some epistemologists, having the right evidence is maybe important, but just not quite enough. Some epistemologists who would fall under this heading of non-evidentialist epistemology want to know something more. They don't just want to know what your evidence for your belief is. They'd also really like to know where this evidence came from. There's a couple of ways we could actually phrase that question. One way of phrasing it is some epistemologists might want to know, what is the source of your belief? Where does it come from? Where'd you get it? Others turn the question onto you, the epistemic agent yourself. Such epistemologists might want to know, what was your state of mind when you accepted this belief? How were you conducting yourself, generally, when you accepted this belief? So in this way, each of these different questions direct us towards very different theories of epistemology, which, rather than completely putting evidence aside and simply saying we don't care about it, that's not what non-evidentialists do, which is why I find the term rather confusing and misleading, but I'm just going with how it's traditionally described here, but that's my 2 cents on that. But these so-called non-evidentialist epistemologists aren't saying they don't care at all about evidence. Actually, on the contrary, they're saying we do care about evidence, and there's something else we'd like to know on top of that. And it has something to do with the way in which the evidence was acquired or the conditions under which a belief was accepted in the first place. Here's a couple of examples. Remember my tabloid analogy where I'm reading a tabloid and they say an alien was captured by the government, and it turns out that the alien participated in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Well, some epistemologists might say right off the bat, well, that's not justified for you to believe. And it has nothing to do with basic beliefs or cohering with systems of beliefs or any of that stuff. It has to do with the source. This source, this tabloid, is not a reliable source of information. It's a tabloid. It's sensationalist. It's marketed for entertainment, principally. So it's really not a reliable source of information in the first place. This school of thought within epistemology is known, again, fittingly, as reliabilism. A reliabilist wants to know whether or not a source of information is actually reliable. Now, by contrast, let's say I read an article in a peer-reviewed journal that's written by a scientist who has studied climate change for 30 or 40 years. It's like all he does, all he thinks about. He writes this article. He's basically saying climate change is bad and you should care about it. And I read this article and I think climate change is bad. I should care about it. On a reliabilist view, I'm perfectly justified in holding that belief. Why? Because this is a reliable source on, I think, most people's appraisal of the meaning of the word reliable. The tabloid that prints sensationalist pictures about aliens and conspiracy theories and such, not so reliable. Now, there's at least one problem with this reliabilist theory, as intuitive as it might seem, and I think it seems fairly intuitive. There's a bit of a controversy, isn't there, over, well, who gets to decide what's a reliable source and what isn't? I mean, is it inconceivable that a peer-reviewed academic journal could print information that's false? Well, no, it happens quite often, actually. It's totally within the realm of possibility that the peer-reviewed article that I'm reading with the climate expert could be wrong. And on the other hand, here's something really crazy to think about. It's not inconceivable for, say, one of those celebrity tabloids to, every once in a while, whether they intend to or not, print some statements that's actually true. Maybe sometimes. It's that old saying, a broken clock is right twice a day. But what if it's not so much to do with the source of belief? What if it has to do with me, the epistemic agent, the person who knows, or at least we're trying to determine whether or not I know? Maybe it has something to do with me. Maybe it has something to do with who I am, how I act, or at least how I was acting and thinking at the time that I accepted a particular proposition. Let's return to my book example. Suppose I told you that this book was 10 feet tall. Now, I know it's maybe hard to tell on the camera, but it's not actually 10 feet tall. It's definitely not 10 feet tall. I don't even think it's 1 foot tall. But let's say I thought it was. And I told you I believe that this book is 10 feet tall. You might say, well, that's just not true. That's just not true at all. Then I tell you, oh, I forgot to mention, I recently ingested like a huge amount of hallucinogenic drugs, like a couple hours ago. Now I think we're getting to the source of my confusion. It seems I'm experiencing what they call Lilliputian effects, right? Where small things are appearing bigger and big things are appearing smaller and such. There's a warped perception going on. I shouldn't accept that belief. Not just because I can intuit that it's not 10 feet tall or measure that it's not 10 feet tall, but because the state of mind that I'm in under the influence of a hallucinogenic drug is not a good, from an epistemic standpoint, is not a good state of mind to be in. I'm not judging anybody. But from an epistemological standpoint, not a very good state to be in. This school of thought within non-evidentialism is known as proper functioning theory. On this view, you are justified in holding a belief as long as your mind was functioning properly when you formed the belief or accepted the proposition. On most people's definition of the term proper functioning, perhaps Terence McKenna might have different ideas, but that's another story. But for most people, taking a whole bunch of hallucinogenic drugs is like, just by definition, my brain is not functioning properly. And so from an epistemic standpoint, I'm not justified in really accepting any beliefs that I'm proposed while under the influence of these chemicals. Now, here's one problem with this theory, though. Let's say I take this copious amount of hallucinogens and I'm hanging out in my house and I hear a bunch of noises going on downstairs, a bunch of rummaging about and shouting, and I start to think that there's a burglar in my house. I get my epistemology book out and I read and I come across proper functioning theory and I'm like, I can't trust myself because I'm under the influence of these hallucinogenic drugs, so I can't accept that belief that there's a burglar in my house. Well, let's imagine that there actually is, though. Like, independent of my rather unusual state of minds that I've induced for myself, there actually objectively is a burglar going through all my things in my house. Is that impossible? I mean, can we not conceive of that being possible? Could it be that I am just cognitively not functioning the way that I'm supposed to be, and yet I accept a belief that happens to be true? Well, from a proper functioning theory standpoint, yeah, I'm not justified. So I don't actually know that there's a burglar in my house. There very well may be one, but I'm not justified in saying that I know it for a fact. So whether or not that's a problem for you would really depend on how expansive you want this word knowledge to be applied. If you think it's really important for someone to be able to say that they know things, even when they're under a unusual state of mind, then this theory might pose some challenges. On the other hand, it is fairly intuitive. I think it has some potential to be helpful in like a psychological setting. You know, like for me, for someone with obsessive compulsive disorder, I find myself kind of attracted to the proper function theory. Like when I'm like in OCD mode, I know that I probably can't accept most of the beliefs that are going through my crazy mind. And that's helpful for me. That's helpful for me from a like mental health standpoint and from a philosophical standpoint, when those two things can kind of conjoin. That can be interesting. But there are limitations to this theory, just as there are with all of them. There are a variety of theories that can be classed under this non-evidentialist heading. There may even be a couple of pretty major ones that I didn't talk about in this video. The purpose of these talks is to give a kind of a just sort of a overview of what I see as the distinguishing features of the different lines of thought that proceed from these different starting points. You know, when we start out with we're looking for justification, should we look for it in evidence? Should we look for it in the conditions under which beliefs were accepted? And going from there, I think is hopefully helpful in making sense of this often labyrinthian kind of maze of theories and concepts and names and so on.